When I saw my husband standing by the kitchen window, motionless, I knew exactly what he was looking at, not a message on my phone, not a bill on the counter, but the black square of the guest room glass where a shadow had moved a heartbeat earlier. His face did not harden. He did not clear his throat or call my name. He simply stood there with that practiced stillness of his, the kind that makes you feel examined without a single question. I watched the tendon in his jaw flicker as the porch light hummed, and I understood that silence can weigh more than any accusation. His hands rested on the sill, steady, like a judge who has already reached a verdict and is only waiting for the right moment to announce it. The house vibrated with small, ordinary sounds, the refrigerator cycling on, the clock ticking like a slow drip, and yet my chest thudded as if alarms were sounding. It wasn't the fear of exposure that shook me. It was the fear that he had seen just enough to believe he knew everything. 3 months ago I made a choice that rerouted the geography of our home, a choice of attention, of closeness, of warmth that arrived in a voice I hadn't heard under this roof for years. Before I explain how a dripping faucet became a fault line, and how a home that looked perfect from the street learned a language of pauses and glances, tell me in the comments the city you're watching from, and answer this. Have you ever kept a secret so carefully that the keeping of it became heavier than the secret itself? Let me tell you how it really happened, and why the worst part of a confession is not the words, but the moment right before them, when the room holds its breath and waits. He came back on a Monday that smelled like cardboard and warm dust. The car pulled into the driveway around noon, and the glare off the windshield turned the front steps into a stage I didn't feel ready to step onto. I had set out glasses on the counter and a pitcher of water with lemon as if refreshment could serve as conversation, as if a bright slice could guide us through years we hadn't shared. When the door opened, the house swallowed a new set of footsteps, familiar in cadence, different in weight. He carried 2 bags and an apology for the mess that wasn't a mess at all. "I'll take these," my husband said, already moving, already filling the air with logistics, closet space, the schedule for the plumber, the list on the fridge. The rhythm of their voices was polite and practical, like men laying planks on a dock. I have lived a long time in a house of competence. Things get fixed. Bills get paid. The lawn is trimmed on Saturdays into a rectangle so disciplined it makes the street look more trustworthy. If a hinge squeaks, oil appears. If a meeting runs late, a text arrives on time. We have never been a couple that breaks dishes or slams doors. We do not throw sharp words. We have routines strong enough to lean against, the way you lean against a railing to watch the river go by and tell yourself that watching is participation. There are nights when we sit shoulder to shoulder, the television painting both our faces blue, and I feel an affection so stable it resembles furniture. It is not that anything is wrong, it is that nothing is allowed to be messy. There is a difference between a life without storms and a sky that never changes. He, my husband's son, set the bags down and looked around as if measuring the room against a memory. He is fully grown, of course, more man than the young face in photos that still live in drawers. Travel has carved a tired kind of brightness into him, an awareness that scans and absorbs. He listens with his eyes first. When he said, "It looks the same," I heard the second sentence he didn't say, and also different. "Your room's ready," I told him, and my voice sounded to me like a freshly made bed, crisp, tucked in, hiding creases. The guest room had been dusted the night before. I had opened the window to let out the stored air and placed a glass on the nightstand without thinking why it mattered. I changed the sheets with a care I usually reserve for holidays. There is a tenderness in making a bed for someone who used to share a roof with you and then stopped. It is a way of smoothing time. He thanked me and brushed the doorframe with his hand the way people do when they arrive somewhere they once knew and are trying to reacquaint their palms with the grain. We ate lunch late. My husband talked through plans for the week, the delivery of a new shelf, an electrician to check the porch light that flickered when the weather turned, the faucet in the hall bath that had started dripping again. I watched the drip in my head, patient, exact, a metronome for what we didn't say. "I can look at it," his son offered, and my husband nodded, relieved to slot a problem into a solution. The men in this house speak best when a tool can be laid on the table. After lunch, I took the plates to the sink and rinsed them while the two of them carried boxes from the car. Water slid across ceramic in clean sheets, the lemon seeds spun in the drain like tiny eyes. Through the window above the sink, I could see the driveway and the two figures moving back and forth between trunk and door, their steps falling into an accidental choreography. If you were a stranger parked on the street, you would say we were a family. You would be right, and that would still be incomplete. We spent the afternoon unpacking things that weren't ours, a coffee mug from somewhere he'd stayed too long, a stack of books with dog-eared pages and hasty marginalia, a jacket that carried the faint smell of rain from a different climate. He thanked me for the shelf space, for the towels, for remembering how he likes his tea. The politeness was real, so was the caution. Every gesture had a chaperone. In the evening, my husband suggested a short drive, just to show how much the town has changed. He loves change when it arrives in the shape of a new grocery store or a widened road. He distrusts it when it is human. The drive was a tour of small renovations. A bakery had become a pharmacy. The park had new benches that looked like they had been designed by a committee determined to offend no one. My husband narrated civic progress, proud of the way the town kept pace without stumbling. I looked at the storefronts and thought of fabric that fades not from neglect but from sunlight. In the back seat, his son watched the sidewalks, the way dogs watch their owner's hands in case a leash moves. At home the evening arranged itself like a picture frame, dinner, dishes, mugs of mint tea that thinned the air with sweetness. My husband went to his office to answer a few emails. I stood in the hallway and listened to the house working, air through vents, wood settling, the tiny rhythmic tap from the bathroom that I had been ignoring for days. Drip. Pause. Drip. It was not urgent, merely insistent. I turned the knob on the faucet to see if a firmer closure would hush it. The tap responded with a stubborn patience only older fixtures have. It would not be scolded shut. "Tomorrow," his son said from the doorway, not startling me so much as aligning with my thought, "I'll handle that." He was leaning on the frame with the comfort of someone who has leaned on many frames and learned not to leave a mark. "Thank you," I said, and the thanks meant a universe of ordinary things, the relief of small help, the comfort of being noticed at the scale of a drip. He smiled, not a showy thing, just a slight folding at the corner of his mouth that acknowledged we had agreed on something true and trivial. I slept badly. The mattress felt like a question I could not answer. In the dark, the house magnifies itself. Distances grow. Walls thicken. The clock breathes. I lay there measuring the space between the two of us, the husband I have built so many calm mornings with, and the space between the room down the hall and the rest of the house. Memory is not a straight road, it is a path that doubles back when you try to walk it forward. I thought of a much younger voice calling from a different stairwell years ago, the way I had learned to arrange snacks and reassurance in the right order, because that is what you do when you mother in any form, you arrange things. You push the world a fraction closer to comfort. Morning arrived with a light the color of old paper. The kettle sighed, the toast popped, the newspaper rested where it always rests. My husband asked about a meeting he had later, I answered. We exchanged the kind of information that makes a day run. The guest room door opened, and he stepped out in a t-shirt and jeans, hair damp from a shower, sleeves pushed to his forearms as if the day would require the cooperation of his hands. "After breakfast," he said, glancing toward the hall bath. "Of course," my husband replied, grateful to tick a box. We moved like parts of a familiar machine, and yet I was aware of the way my heartbeat altered when the faucet was mentioned, as though that simple fixture had become an actor in a play only I had read. "Do you need anything?" I asked, and he shook his head. "I'll grab the toolbox," he said, and my husband disappeared into the garage to fetch it, humming a tune without melody. In the doorway of the hall bath, the tile reflected a clean, pale light. The mirror had the forgiving sheen that makes faces look rested. The faucet, silver-dulled to a pleasant gray, carried its own memory of hands. He turned the handles experimentally and listened as if plumbing spoke a language he understood. I stood in the hall with a dish towel in my hands like a prop I had forgotten to set down. "It's small," I said, "about the leak, but not only about the leak." "Small things can flood a room," he answered, and then looked away quickly, aware of his words. My husband returned with the toolbox, placed it on the counter, and suggested he'd be in the office if anyone needed him. "Take your time," he said, which in our lives often means take your care. The office door closed with its polite click. The house resumed its chorus of domestic sounds. Somewhere a bird argued with the morning. The faucet offered its tiny metronome, less a flaw than a beat. If a stranger were to pause on the sidewalk outside and glance at our window just then, they would see 3 figures in the outlines of their roles: homeowner, helper, wife. They would be right. And it would still be incomplete. I folded the towel and placed it on the radiator, then stepped back as he knelt to study the connections beneath the sink. The wrenches glinted like quiet punctuation. He reached for one, eyes narrowed in that concentration that makes the rest of the world hush. "Call if you need a second set of hands," I said, and my voice, to my own ears, sounded steady. He didn't look up. "I will," he answered. The drip paused, as if it, too, were listening. The day gathered itself around us, ordinary and exact, and the house held its breath in the way old houses do when something is about to change, not with a crash, but with a clockwise turn, a single added thread, the simplest movement of 2 people in a small, bright room. Morning made the tiles look cleaner than they were, as if light could bleach away the faint mineral rings around the faucet base. He set the toolbox on the bath mat and knelt in a way that suggested he had knelt in 100 small rooms like this, learning more about houses than most people ever want to know. I stood in the doorway with my hands half folded, a posture left over from years of offering help and then stepping back so the offered person could keep their pride. The mirror framed both of us when I glanced sideways, him intent, me composed. The drip felt louder because we were listening for it. He turned the water off at the valves and the pipe exhaled a thin breath. "Gasket's tired," he said, not looking up, as if speaking to the patient rather than to me. I nodded though he could not see it. The word tired fit more than rubber. He loosened the cap, coaxed out a worn washer, held it in his palm like a coin rubbed flat by too many pockets. He checked the toolbox, frowned at a compartment that offered the wrong size, and set the old piece on the counter with the respect you give to anything that has served longer than designed. "We might need a run to the hardware store," he added. My husband's office chair creaked down the hall, a soft reminder that the house contained separate weather systems. "There's a small kit in the pantry," I said. "Second shelf, blue lid." He looked at me then, eyebrows raised with an approving surprise that made me feel seen in a way that had nothing to do with mirrors. He found the kit, returned, sifted through rings and screws until the right circle surfaced. His hands worked with patient economy, every motion neat, as if mess were a language he refused to speak. While he worked, we made the kind of conversation that covers true subjects without naming them. He asked how long the drip had been going. I answered in days and hesitated in feelings. I asked about the places he had stayed most recently. He listed towns like map pins, each with a small, practical detail: a quiet diner, a reliable mechanic, a library where the chairs did not wobble. He said he liked towns that could be learned on foot. I said I liked knowing where the light switches were in the dark. We agreed, without saying so, that familiarity is its own kind of courage. The gasket seated, he tightened, turned, and opened the valves. Water rushed, then quieted into obedience. The faucet settled into stillness as if it had been taught to meditate. He watched for a minute to be certain, head tilted, mouth a patient line. The mirror caught his concentration and doubled it, so that for a moment the room held two of him and two of me, all of us listening to a silence we had asked for. "Done," he said softly. He stood, wiped his hands on a cloth, and reached past me to set the cloth on the radiator. The movement brought us into the same small square of air. I could smell metal and soap on his skin, the honest sense of work and hot water. The closeness was accidental in the way some accidents are the product of countless nearly identical moments that never quite aligned until one morning they did. My heartbeat counted out the interval between breath and thought. Down the hall, a calendar page rasped as it was turned in my husband's office. A car passed outside, tires whispering over asphalt still damp from last night's rain. The house, reassured by the fixed leak, resumed its normal voice. I stepped half a pace back and then forward again without meaning to, the motion small and foolish and true. He noticed and held still, the way you hold still when a skittish bird has landed on your wrist. "This looks better," I said, and heard how thin the sentence was, a bedsheet held against a draft. He smiled slightly, not triumph but relief, a craftsman's pleasure at a job concluded. His hand brushed the faucet handle one last time, a check, a farewell. The brushed metal reflected a short, bright line that trembled and steadied. We did not have language for the other tremor. He thanked me for finding the kit. I told him it was nothing, which was the opposite of what it felt like. In the mirror our eyes met and did not rush to look elsewhere. You can live in a house for years and forget how narrow a doorway is until two people need to pass at once. We were already through, and still there was not room for everything present. What happened next was not planned and not theatrical. No music swelled. No clock struck the hour. The house kept breathing the way houses do. He turned from the sink, and I stepped to let him by, and somehow we stopped in exactly the same place. The distance between us gave up. We kissed. The sentence is short because the act was simple. It did not revise the past or foretell the future. It sat in the present like a lit match that had not yet found tinder. It did not ask for witnesses. It did not promise a second. It announced itself and ended, and yet its echo moved through me like a new line in a familiar song. I stepped back first, a single inch that felt like a mile. He looked at the floor as if the tile might offer advice. "I should check the shut-off valves again," he said, and the useful words landed between us like folded towels. I said I would make tea. We performed small movements with exaggerated care, each gesture a truce. The faucet held its silence, the only object in the room that knew exactly what it was supposed to do. In the kitchen I measured leaves and water as if precision could return a room to its original temperature. The kettle gathered itself and sang. I set 3 cups on a tray and counted them twice, as if arithmetic could steady my hands. When I carried the tray to the dining table, my husband stepped out of his office, thanked me, and remarked that the house sounded happier. He meant the absence of drip. I nodded and mentioned the gasket as if it were a character we had all enjoyed meeting. We drank. The talk found safe edges, the weather, the plan to replace the porch bulb, a neighbor's new dog. My husband asked if the faucet was fixed for good and received a calm report. "Good," he said. "A small thing, but it adds up." We all agreed. I cleared the cups before the silence could lengthen into something with a name. Later, when sunlight flattened into late afternoon and the rooms dulled into their evening colors, I stood alone in the bathroom and looked at the faucet. The metal showed no fingerprints. The mirror showed a woman who could pass for herself. I touched the handle and listened to the well-behaved hush. In that quiet, a simple truth hovered. Sometimes a repair reveals the crack you were not measuring. I turned off the light, and the house accepted the decision with its usual grace. The morning after the faucet was fixed carried the faint scent of damp earth from the rain that had fallen overnight. Light came in slow and pale, as if reluctant to commit to the day. I moved through the kitchen with the measured steps of someone who did not want to wake a sleeping house, though everyone was already awake. My husband sat at the table reading, his glasses resting low on his nose, the paper folded into neat halves. Across from him, the chair meant for a third was empty but angled, as if it had been recently used. The clink of a spoon against porcelain came from the guest room direction, followed by the muted thud of a cabinet closing. Breakfast passed in a polite rhythm. We talked about the weather, about an upcoming delivery, about a neighbor's garden that was already showing early blooms. There was nothing in the words to give us away, nothing in the tones to betray the new contour in the air. Yet the space between my chair and his felt different, altered, not by distance but by something invisible and unmeasured. I kept my gaze steady, focusing on the coffee steam as if it could be a screen. By mid-morning my husband had gone to his office again, taking with him the sound of papers shifting and a keyboard tapping. I cleared the table and began wiping the counters, a chore done more for the distraction than necessity. The sound of footsteps on the back steps made me pause. He appeared in the doorway, holding a small stack of envelopes. "Mail was in the box," he said, placing it on the counter. His voice was casual, but our eyes met for a second longer than required, as if to confirm that the day before had not been imagined. I busied myself with sorting the mail, giving each envelope more attention than it deserved. He leaned against the frame, hands in his pockets, a posture that managed to look both at ease and watchful. The kitchen clock clicked its way through the silence. He mentioned needing to pick up a part for something he was repairing in his room, a hinge that stuck, nothing urgent. "It's in town," he said, and the words hung there like an offer without form. I asked which store. He told me. Then, after a pause, he asked if I wanted to come, since I knew the quickest route. The drive was short, but the landscape felt larger than usual. Early spring colors lined the road, pale greens, the hesitant pink of blossoms not yet convinced winter was over. The air through the open window smelled faintly of wet bark. We spoke in fragments, the kind of small observations that left room for thought in between, a field that had been cleared, a sign for a fairground event, a corner shop that had changed owners. These were safe topics, but even in their safety there was an awareness of everything unsaid. At the hardware store, the aisles smelled of metal and wood shavings. He found the hinge quickly, holding it up with a small nod of satisfaction. I picked up a packet of screws I didn't need, more to extend the moment than to make a purchase. We walked back to the counter, the rhythm of our steps in sync. The clerk rang us up with the disinterest of someone who had seen every combination of shoppers imaginable. Outside, the light had shifted warmer, and the clouds had broken just enough to let the sun mark the pavement. On the way back, we passed the park. He slowed slightly, glancing toward the entrance. "Do you have time?" he asked, meaning for a walk. I said I did. We parked near a row of benches and stepped onto the gravel path. The air was cooler here, shaded by trees just beginning to leaf. The sound of distant children playing mixed with the occasional call of a bird. We walked without hurry, without the need to fill every silence. A breeze lifted a strand of hair across my cheek, and before I could move it, he reached out briefly to brush it aside. The gesture was light, unclaimed, yet it left a faint trail of warmth. We circled the park once, returning to the car without having discussed anything that might matter to anyone else. Back at the house, my husband was in the garden, kneeling by a row of soil he was preparing for planting. He greeted us with a question about whether the store had what we needed. "Yes," was all that was said. No details were offered. He went back to his work, patting the soil into place. The afternoon settled into its compartments, my husband in the garden, me in the kitchen, and him moving between the guest room and the garage, carrying tools and wood scraps. Each time our paths crossed, the pause between words was noticeable only to us. Once, in the hallway, we both stepped aside at the same time to let the other pass, ending up briefly face to face. No one spoke. The air in that small space held the same weight as the previous morning in the bathroom. Near evening, I stood at the back window, looking out at the garden where my husband worked under the dimming sky. He straightened, wiped his hands on his pants, and glanced toward the house. For a moment, I thought his gaze was fixed not on the window but on something beyond it, something inside. I stepped back from the glass without thinking, the reflex of someone who doesn't want to be studied too closely. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision. He was behind me, setting a folded tarp on the chair by the door. Our eyes met in the reflection of the glass, a meeting layered with the knowledge of the past 2 days. Dinner was quiet but not strained. We spoke about the weather forecast, about when the seedlings might be ready to move outdoors, about a neighbor's new fence. Each sentence ended neatly, like a line drawn under a column of figures. After the dishes were done, my husband excused himself to make a phone call. I stayed in the kitchen, wiping the already clean counters. He lingered in the doorway for a moment, then stepped out into the night air. I could hear his footsteps on the porch boards, steady, unhurried. The house closed in on itself as night settled. Lights in certain rooms were left on, others switched off with precision. In the quiet, the memory of the day threaded itself through my thoughts, the brush of his hand against my hair, the way his voice changed when he asked if I had time, the reflection in the window that caught both of us. Outside, my husband's voice carried faintly from the porch, speaking to someone in a tone I couldn't read. I stood by the sink, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears, and wondered how long the balance could hold between what was visible and what was known. The following morning began with a light mist hanging low over the street, the kind that softened edges and blurred the line between ground and sky. From the kitchen window, I watched droplets bead on the garden fence, each one reflecting a distorted fragment of the house. My husband had left early for an appointment, his absence leaving a quieter rhythm in the rooms. The air felt different without the familiar background noise of his movements, lighter, but also more hollow. I moved through the house in slippers, collecting stray cups and folding the throw blanket left on the sofa, the simple rituals of a morning without witnesses. The sound of the guest room door opening reached me before I saw him. His footsteps were slower than usual, deliberate, as if he was already thinking about the day ahead. He appeared in the doorway with a set of keys in his hand, turning them over idly. He mentioned needing to drive into town for something he had ordered earlier in the week. The words were framed casually, but the slight pause afterward felt like an opening, as if I could step into it. I asked what he needed to pick up. He told me, sandpaper and a specific type of oil for a piece of wood he was restoring. Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked if I wanted to come along. I said yes before I had weighed the decision. The drive was longer than the last trip we'd taken together, the road stretching out in smooth gray ribbons. Early sunlight pressed through breaks in the mist, laying pale gold stripes across the asphalt. Fields on either side were heavy with moisture, the grass bowing under the weight of it. We talked in scattered pieces, how the hardware store in town had better stock than the one nearby, how the air smelled different after rain, how the leaves were already hinting at deeper greens. None of the topics were remarkable, but the pauses between them felt charged, as though silence itself was an active participant in the conversation. When we reached the store, the parking lot was mostly empty. Inside, the scent of sawdust and varnish met us, sharp and clean. He moved with purpose, collecting what he needed quickly, but lingered at certain shelves, running his fingers over the grain of display boards or inspecting the bristles of brushes. I followed at a slow pace, tracing the outlines of tools with my eyes. At the counter, the cashier greeted him like a returning customer, exchanging a few words about the weather before ringing up the items. As we stepped outside, the light had grown brighter, the mist lifting to reveal a sky streaked with high, thin clouds. On the way back, he suggested a detour along a road that wound toward the edge of town. It was quieter there, lined with older houses set far back from the street. Some were freshly painted, others showed their age in peeling trim and leaning porches. He pointed out a small workshop tucked between two larger buildings, saying it had been there for decades. We slowed near a narrow bridge over a shallow creek, the water below catching the sun in shifting patterns. Neither of us seemed in a hurry to reach the house. We arrived home to find my husband's car still absent from the driveway. The garden tools he'd left by the shed earlier were undisturbed, their metal edges glinting faintly in the afternoon light. Inside, the house was cool, the kind of cool that comes from walls holding on to the memory of morning air. I set my bag down in the kitchen while he carried his purchases to the guest room. A moment later, I heard the faint sound of sandpaper sliding over wood, a steady, almost meditative rhythm. I busied myself with preparing lunch, slicing bread, arranging cheese and fruit on a plate, boiling water for tea. The ordinary actions calmed my hands even as my thoughts moved restlessly. When everything was ready, I carried the tray to the table and called out that the food was there. He appeared a few minutes later, hands brushed clean but still carrying the scent of fresh wood. We ate quietly, the conversation turning towards small domestic topics, which cupboard needed reorganizing, how long it might be before the garden soil was ready for planting. Every so often our eyes met across the table, brief acknowledgments that something unspoken existed between the lines of our words. After lunch, he returned to his work in the guest room while I washed the dishes. Through the half-open door, I caught glimpses of him adjusting clamps, leaning over the piece of wood with a focus that excluded everything else. The rasp of sandpaper was oddly soothing, a constant note in the background of the afternoon. I moved between rooms, folding laundry, tidying shelves, each task carried out with more precision than necessary. By late afternoon, my husband returned. His shoes tracked a faint line of dry dirt across the entryway, which he paused to brush away with the edge of his foot before stepping fully inside. He greeted us both, asked about the day, and listened to the brief summaries we offered. There was nothing in his tone to suggest suspicion or knowledge, only the even, measured voice I had always known. Still, I felt my posture straighten as though in anticipation of an unspoken question. The evening settled into its familiar pattern. My husband read in the living room while I prepared dinner. The scent of roasting vegetables filled the house, blending with the faint tang of oil from the guest room. When the three of us sat down to eat, the conversation circled the same safe topics: the weather, the slow progress of spring, and neighbors' plans to repaint their house. We moved through the meal with quiet efficiency, clearing plates and stacking them neatly by the sink. After the dishes were done, I stepped outside onto the back porch for a moment of air. The sky had shifted into the muted colors of dusk, the horizon washed in pale lavender and soft gray. The garden lay still, the soil dark and damp under the fading light. I could hear faint sounds from inside, the turning of a page, the creak of a chair, the muted thud of something being set down in another room. The air was cool enough to raise a slight shiver along my arms. When I came back inside, my husband was still in the living room, absorbed in his book. The guest room door was closed, the faint light from under it a quiet sign of work continuing. I moved through the house turning off unnecessary lights, the simple motions marking the end of the day. The house felt balanced, each of us in our own space, and yet that balance rested on something fragile, an unspoken agreement, or perhaps a shared hesitation to disturb what was still unacknowledged. The day broke clear, the sky a pale expanse without a single cloud to soften it. From the kitchen window, the garden looked freshly washed by the dew, each blade of grass carrying its own bead of light. My husband was already outside by the shed, sorting through a pile of tools for the day's work. I moved through the kitchen quietly, making coffee and slicing fruit, the small rituals grounding me. The air inside the house was still cool from the night, and I kept a sweater draped over my shoulders as I worked. The guest room door opened, and he stepped out, his hair still damp from a shower, a faint scent of soap trailing behind him. He offered a brief greeting and moved toward the counter to pour himself a cup of coffee. We exchanged a few short sentences about the weather, the kind of polite words that carried no weight for anyone listening from a distance. Yet, standing that close, the familiarity of the past days pressed into the space between us. I handed him a plate with toast without being asked, a gesture that felt both natural and deliberate. My husband came in a few minutes later, his boots leaving a trail of faint dust on the tile. He mentioned needing to drive to a supplier in another town for some parts, a trip that would take most of the afternoon. His tone was matter-of-fact, focused on the list of items he needed, and he didn't linger long before heading back outside to load the truck. The sound of the engine starting and fading down the street left the house in an unusual quiet, the kind that makes each small movement sound louder. We lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, clearing plates slowly, rinsing them under the steady stream of water. He asked if I had plans for the day, and I told him only the usual: laundry, tidying the upstairs rooms, maybe reorganizing the pantry. He mentioned wanting to work on a project in the garage but said it could wait until later. For a moment, neither of us moved, the unspoken weighing heavier than the tasks we listed. The afternoon light poured in generously, filling the hallways and making the air look warmer than it felt. I set about the laundry first, sorting the clothes into neat piles, the rhythm of folding giving my hands something to do. I carried a basket into the living room to fold on the couch, the sunlight falling in angled stripes across the cushions. He appeared in the doorway, pausing as though to decide whether to speak. He said he had been thinking about adjusting one of the shelves in the pantry and asked if I could help hold it steady. It was a simple enough request, one that would normally pass without thought, but I found myself agreeing more quickly than necessary. In the pantry, the air smelled faintly of spices and dry goods. We stood close in the narrow space, maneuvering the wooden shelf into place. My hands pressed against the edge while he tightened the screws. It was quiet except for the soft sound of the screwdriver turning and the occasional shift of weight on the wooden floor. When he finished, we both stepped back, and in that pause, the small room seemed to close in around us. Our eyes met, and for a moment it felt like everything else in the house had gone still. We kissed. It happened without warning, without a lead-in beyond the shared quiet and the nearness. It was brief, just enough to cross a line we had already been circling. When it ended, we both stepped back as if some instinct demanded it. Neither of us spoke immediately. The shelf stood level, its purpose fulfilled, but the air in the pantry carried something unsettled. I left first, carrying an empty jar to the kitchen as an excuse to move. He followed a moment later, setting the screwdriver on the counter and mentioning that he might spend some time in the garage after all. We resumed the ordinary pattern of the day, each of us keeping to separate spaces. I dusted the upstairs rooms, arranged clean towels in the linen closet, and avoided lingering in doorways where our paths might cross unexpectedly. By late afternoon, my husband returned, the sound of his truck rolling into the driveway breaking the stretch of quiet. He came inside with a bag of parts and a thin layer of road dust on his jacket. He asked how the day had gone, and we both offered vague, neutral answers. He seemed satisfied and moved on to unpack his purchases on the dining table. Dinner came together in a steady rhythm, vegetables roasting in the oven, bread warming on the rack, the table set with practiced efficiency. We ate together, the conversation looping around his trip, the traffic on the highway, and the weather forecast for the next week. The words were easy, the tone even, but every so often I caught myself glancing toward him, toward the guest chair, and then forcing my eyes back to my plate. My husband didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. After dinner, we cleared the table and washed the dishes. The kitchen was left in order, every surface wiped, every item returned to its place. My husband went to his office to finish some paperwork, and I stepped onto the back porch, letting the cool evening air settle over me. The garden was darkening, the shapes of the plants blending into the earth. From inside, the faint sounds of movement carried, a door closing, a chair shifting, the low hum of the refrigerator. The day had ended much as it had begun, in a house where every action could be explained, and yet the memory of the pantry hung in the air like a scent that refused to fade. The morning began with a thin, steady rain tapping against the windows, soft enough to blur the edges of the garden into shades of green and gray. The air in the house felt cooler than usual, holding the dampness from outside. My husband was already at the dining table, a mug of coffee beside him and a stack of paperwork spread out in front. He glanced up briefly when I entered, offered a quiet morning, and returned to his notes. His focus on the papers left the rest of the room free of questions, the silence broken only by the occasional turn of a page. I moved about the kitchen, heating water for tea, slicing bread, and arranging breakfast in a slow, deliberate order. The sound of footsteps came from the hallway, a measured pace that matched the rhythm of the rain. He appeared, leaning slightly on the doorframe before stepping into the room. His greeting was casual, but there was a pause in his voice, a fraction too long to be entirely ordinary. I placed an extra plate on the table without comment. The three of us ate quietly, conversation drifting toward the weather, the state of the garden beds, and an expected delivery later in the week. After breakfast, my husband gathered his papers and mentioned that he needed to spend most of the day at the office in town. He listed a few errands he might run on the way back and estimated he'd return in the evening. The sound of his truck pulling out of the driveway left the house wrapped in the quiet hum of rain and the occasional creak of the floorboards settling. I began tidying the kitchen, rinsing dishes, and stacking them neatly to dry. He lingered at the counter, finishing his coffee, then set the cup down and mentioned he was planning to sort through some boxes in the attic. The suggestion hung in the air, an ordinary enough task, but one that required climbing the narrow stairs and navigating the low ceiling where light came only from a small window. I offered to help, and he agreed without hesitation. The attic smelled faintly of dust and old wood, the air dry despite the rain outside. Boxes were stacked along the walls, some neatly labeled, others marked only by fading handwriting. We worked side by side, shifting cartons, opening a few to check their contents, and repacking them with more care than they had been stored. The patter of rain on the roof above was steady, almost metronomic, and the quiet between us seemed to follow its lead. In one box, I found a stack of folded blankets that smelled faintly of cedar. In another, he uncovered a collection of tools that had belonged to his father, carefully wrapped, though some showed signs of years without use. We spoke little, just enough to coordinate where to place each item. The narrow space made it impossible to avoid brushing past each other, each movement requiring a silent negotiation of steps. After an hour, the work slowed. We stood near the small attic window, watching the rain blur the view of the street below. The houses across the way looked softened, their outlines washed into the gray air. Neither of us moved for a moment, the sound of the rain seeming louder in that confined space. When we turned toward each other, the shift was small but decisive, and in that quiet, we both understood it was a choice. We kissed. It was as brief as it had been before, a moment suspended between the steady rhythm of the rain and the muted light through the window. When it ended, we both stepped back, the space between us filled again with the practical order of the attic. He picked up a smaller box, and I followed him down the narrow stairs, the wooden steps creaking under our weight. Back in the main part of the house, we returned to separate tasks. He carried the tools to the garage, and I took the blankets to the laundry to air them out. The rain continued through the afternoon, its steady sound a backdrop to the movements of the house. I folded laundry, dusted the shelves in the living room, and checked the pantry for what we might need for dinner. By late afternoon, my husband returned. He carried a bag from the market along with his work papers and set them on the counter. He asked about the day in a tone that was calm, unhurried. I mentioned the attic sorting, and he nodded, saying it was good to finally get through those boxes. We unpacked the groceries together, each item placed neatly in its place. Dinner was simple, soup simmering on the stove, bread warmed in the oven. We sat together, the three of us, the conversation moving easily through the safe territory of errands completed and weather forecasts. The rain eased into a fine mist outside, the garden glistening in the fading light. After the dishes were washed and the kitchen restored to order, my husband settled in the living room with a book. I lingered for a moment at the back door, looking out at the damp yard, then turned off the light. The attic door stood closed at the end of the hallway, silent, holding its own part of the day's story. Upstairs, the sound of the rain faded, replaced by the softer quiet of night settling over the house, each of us in our own space, the air carrying the memory of that brief, unspoken moment beneath the roof. The morning light was sharper than it had been in days, the kind that cut across the kitchen floor in clean, pale lines. My husband was already dressed for the day, moving between the counter and the dining table as he packed a folder and a thermos into his bag. He said he had a meeting out of town, one that would keep him late, and mentioned the possibility of stopping for dinner before heading back. His voice carried the steady rhythm of someone outlining a plan they had no reason to doubt would happen exactly as described. I nodded, offered the usual questions about his route, and watched him leave with the calm of habit. The sound of his truck starting and backing down the driveway left behind an almost tangible silence. The house was still. From the guest room came the muffled sound of drawers being opened and closed, then footsteps moving toward the kitchen. He appeared in the doorway with a faint trace of sawdust on his sleeve, as if the morning had already been claimed by work. He asked if I needed anything from the store. I shook my head. The air between us was quiet but not empty, carrying the residue of every unspoken exchange from the days before. The hours that followed unfolded without urgency. I moved between rooms, dusting surfaces, checking on the laundry, and watering the plants lined up along the windowsill. He spent time in the garage, the muted thud of tools and the low hum of a sander filtering into the rest of the house. At intervals, our paths crossed, in the hallway, on the back porch, in the kitchen, and each meeting carried the same measured awareness. By mid-afternoon, the sunlight softened into the kind of gold that made the edges of the house seem warmer. I was in the living room when he appeared, leaning lightly on the doorframe. He asked if I wanted to help him carry something from the garage, a piece of furniture he'd been refinishing. I agreed, setting aside the book I hadn't been reading so much as holding. Outside, the air was cooler, the faint scent of cut wood mingling with the last of the morning sawdust. We each took one end of the table and carried it slowly toward the guest room, adjusting our steps to match. Once inside, we set the table down against the far wall. He knelt to check the legs for stability, running a cloth over the surface to remove any remaining dust. I stood nearby, my hands resting lightly on the edge, feeling the faint vibration of his movements through the wood. He looked up, meeting my eyes briefly before glancing toward the door, as though confirming we were still alone. There was no discussion, no deliberate step forward, just the same small gravity that had been pulling at the edges of our days. The room held its breath as if it understood. We spent the night together. The words are simple. They leave out the weight of the hours that followed, the way the air seemed to shift, the subtle change in how the walls held sound. The night passed in a rhythm without interruption, without any sound from outside to remind us of the world beyond the closed door. It was as though the house itself had agreed to be still. Morning arrived with a muted gray light that made it difficult to tell the hour. I woke before he did, the quiet making every small sound, every shift of the sheets, every creak of the floor beyond the room more noticeable. For a moment, I stayed still, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of breathing beside me. Eventually, I rose, moving carefully so as not to disturb the balance of the moment. The floor was cool under my feet as I crossed to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the garden glistening under a thin layer of dew. I dressed quickly and left the room, the hallway stretching ahead in its usual order. In the kitchen, I set about making coffee, the familiar motions grounding me. The house felt different, but the day would still require its ordinary shape. Soon, I heard the sound of the guest room door opening, followed by his steps approaching. He entered quietly, offering a small nod in place of a greeting. We moved around each other in the kitchen with a practiced ease, the space between us carrying a new kind of awareness. Not long after, the sound of a truck in the driveway broke the morning stillness. My husband was home earlier than expected, his voice calling out as the front door closed behind him. I felt the air in the kitchen tighten, but outwardly, everything remained composed. He stepped into the room, setting his bag on the counter and explaining that the meeting had been cancelled, leaving him the rest of the day free. I nodded, listening, my hand steady on the coffee pot. Behind me, I heard the faint scrape of a chair as it was pushed back, the sound of someone excusing themselves from the room without words. The day resumed in its new arrangement. My husband stayed close, moving between the living room and the porch, checking small things around the house. I kept to the kitchen, preparing lunch and answering his casual questions. The guest room door stayed closed for most of the afternoon, the silence behind it blending into the steady background of the house. As evening came, the light shifted once more, settling into the soft shadows that seemed to draw the day to a close. We sat together for dinner, the three of us, each speaking in turn about the weather, the work done, and the plans for the week ahead. The conversation was calm, the pace unhurried, but beneath it, the quiet shape of the morning lingered, unacknowledged, yet unmistakable. The morning after his unexpected early return unfolded with a tension that had no clear shape but filled the air nonetheless. My husband was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, standing at the counter with a mug in his hand, reading something on his phone. The faint scent of fresh coffee hung between us. He looked up briefly, offering a polite morning before returning his attention to the screen. His tone was even, but the way his eyes lingered for a second longer than usual left a question unspoken. I moved through the motions of making breakfast, laying out plates, slicing bread, setting the kettle on to boil. The sound of the guest room door opening came a few minutes later, footsteps approaching at an unhurried pace. He entered, his expression neutral, greeting both of us with the same measured calm. The three of us shared the table, speaking in short exchanges about the weather, errands, and the possibility of rain later in the week. There was no obvious sign in my husband's manner that he suspected anything, but something in the way he occasionally glanced from one of us to the other made it impossible for me to fully relax. After breakfast, my husband gathered a few tools from the shed and mentioned he planned to spend the morning repairing a section of the garden fence. His voice was casual, but his decision to work so close to the house kept him within sight of the windows. I offered to bring him water later, and he nodded without looking up from the checklist he was making. The sound of the back door closing left the kitchen momentarily quiet before the faint rhythm of hammering began outside. Inside, I set about clearing the table, rinsing plates, and stacking them neatly in the dish rack. He lingered for a moment, setting his empty cup on the counter, his gaze drifting toward the window where my husband's figure moved in the garden. We exchanged no words, only a brief glance that carried more than either of us was willing to acknowledge aloud. He left the kitchen and I heard his steps fade toward the garage. The rest of the morning passed in parallel lines. I moved through my list of household tasks, dusting the shelves in the living room, sweeping the hallway, and reorganizing a drawer in the pantry. Outside, my husband's hammering and the occasional scrape of wood on gravel marked his steady progress. Every so often, I caught sight of him through a window, his head bent over his work, the focus in his movements unbroken. Around midday, I carried a glass of water to the garden. He took it with a brief word of thanks, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand before returning to the fence. I lingered only long enough to ask if he needed anything else. His reply was short, "No, I'm fine," and his attention returned to the task at hand. There was nothing in his voice that hinted at suspicion, but his eyes, when they met mine for that moment, felt heavier than usual, as if measuring more than my words. Back inside, I found him in the hallway, coming from the garage with a small box of nails. He asked quietly if my husband would be outside for much longer. I said I didn't know, keeping my voice even. He nodded and stepped past me, the faint scent of wood polish following him. We crossed paths again later when he came to the kitchen for something from the fridge. Each exchange was brief, the kind that could mean nothing to anyone overhearing, but the pauses between our sentences said otherwise. In the afternoon, the rain my husband had predicted began, a steady patter that softened the sounds from outside. The work on the fence stopped, and he came in, leaving his boots by the back door. I made tea, and the three of us sat together in the living room, each occupied with our own distractions. My husband read from a folded newspaper, occasionally making a comment about a headline. I responded politely. He sat quietly, flipping through a small instruction booklet for a tool he'd been using in the garage. The conversation never strayed from safe topics, but the awareness between the three of us made the air feel layered. My husband's glances seemed casual, yet I noticed he never let them rest on one person for long. Each time I caught his eye, he offered a faint smile, the kind that could mean nothing, or everything. By evening, the rain had stopped, leaving the garden dark and wet under the dim light of the porch. I prepared dinner, moving carefully around the kitchen as if the weight of the day could be lightened by keeping everything in its proper order. The three of us ate together, the meal passing in a rhythm so controlled it almost felt rehearsed. Plates were cleared, dishes washed, and each of us retreated to our own parts of the house. Later, as I stood in the quiet kitchen turning off the last of the lights, I saw movement in the reflection of the window, my husband crossing the living room behind me, pausing at the threshold before continuing down the hall. The image stayed with me, not because of what it showed, but because of how still he had been in that moment, as though watching something only he could fully see. The house settled into its night silence. Doors closed softly, footsteps faded, and the steady hum of the refrigerator filled the gaps. I went upstairs, the familiar creak of the second step sounding louder than usual, and paused at the landing. Behind the closed doors, each of us occupied a separate space, but the lines between them no longer felt as solid as they once had. The next morning arrived with a low, muted light that made it hard to tell whether the sky was covered in clouds or simply slow to wake. I moved quietly through the kitchen, starting the kettle, the air carrying the faint scent of rain left from the night before. My husband entered a few minutes later, already dressed for the day. He poured himself coffee, sat at the table, and unfolded the newspaper without a word. His calm, unhurried movements were the same as always, but there was something in the way he occasionally paused mid-sentence while reading, as if listening for sounds outside the printed words, that set my nerves on edge. The guest room door opened, and footsteps approached. He stepped in, greeting us both with the same level tone. The three of us shared the table, the conversation moving briefly to a delivery scheduled for later that day and the state of the garden after the rain. My husband's questions were simple, almost routine, but each time his eyes shifted between us, I felt the weight of them. There was no direct accusation, nothing in his words to hold on to, yet the pauses between them suggested more than they revealed. After breakfast, my husband gathered his jacket and a set of keys, mentioning that he had to meet someone in town about a property matter. He didn't specify how long he would be gone, only that he'd be back sometime in the afternoon. The words felt deliberate in their vagueness. He left without hurry, and the sound of the truck faded down the road until the house returned to its quiet state. I began clearing the table, stacking the plates and carrying them to the sink. He stayed nearby, leaning against the counter, his gaze fixed on the view through the window. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The house felt larger in the absence of its third occupant, but the sense of watchfulness remained, as if my husband's presence had only shifted rather than disappeared. The morning passed slowly. I worked through small household tasks, folding laundry, straightening books on the shelves, wiping down surfaces that didn't need it. He moved between the garage and the guest room, the sound of tools and the faint scrape of sandpaper marking his progress on some project. At times, our paths crossed in the hallway, and each time there was the same quiet acknowledgement, brief but weighted. Around midday, I stepped outside to bring in a few potted plants before the next bout of rain forecast for the evening. The garden was damp underfoot, the air cool and carrying the scent of wet soil. From the corner of my eye, I noticed movement at the far end of the street, a dark-colored car slowing as it passed the house. I didn't think much of it until I saw it again a few minutes later, heading in the opposite direction. Something about the deliberate pace made me uneasy, but I turned my attention back to the plants, telling myself it was nothing. When I came back inside, I found him in the kitchen, looking down at something in his hand, a small, folded piece of paper. He set it on the counter when I entered, but not before I caught sight of my husband's handwriting. The message was brief, just a few lines, but enough to still my breath, a note addressed to him, stating that they should talk soon and signed without any flourish, just a name. There was no question in the words, no clear context, yet the implication was hard to miss. My husband had left it deliberately. He looked at me once, then pushed the note across the counter so it was no longer in front of him. We didn't speak about it. He walked away toward the garage, leaving me standing there with the paper between my hands, its edges slightly creased from where it had been folded and refolded. I tucked it into a drawer before I could decide what to do with it. The rest of the afternoon moved with a strange slowness. My husband returned earlier than I expected, the sound of the truck in the driveway pulling me instantly into motion. He came in carrying a small bag from the market, setting it on the counter with a casual greeting. His gaze swept the kitchen briefly, landing for a second too long on the closed drawer where I had placed the note. He asked about the delivery that had been scheduled earlier. I told him it had arrived and was stored in the pantry. His response was a nod, his expression unreadable. Dinner was quieter than usual. The three of us ate together, the conversation moving only when necessary to discuss the food or the week's schedule. My husband seemed at ease on the surface, speaking in his usual steady tone, but I noticed the way his attention drifted, as if he were studying a map in his mind. Each time his eyes met mine, there was a flicker of something deliberate, an awareness that wasn't new, but sharper now. After the meal, we cleared the table together. My husband dried the dishes while I put them away, our movements precise, without unnecessary overlap. He asked once if the guest room was comfortable enough for the work being done there. The question was casual, even polite, but the pause before his eyes met mine made it feel heavier. I answered simply that it was. He didn't comment further. By the time night settled over the house, the sense of something approaching had grown, though nothing had been said outright. The rooms were quiet, but the silence felt like it had a shape, as if it were being held in place by someone's deliberate choice. I moved through the familiar routine, locking the back door, checking that the windows were secure, turning off the lights one by one. In the hallway, I passed the closed door of the guest room and kept walking, resisting the urge to stop. At the far end, I turned toward the bedroom I shared with my husband. He was already there, seated on the edge of the bed, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He looked up briefly as I entered, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, then lowered his gaze again. The house settled into its nighttime rhythm, but my mind stayed with the folded note in the drawer and the quiet way my husband had looked at both of us that evening. It wasn't accusation, not yet, but it wasn't indifference either. Something had shifted, and I could feel it pressing in from every wall. The following morning arrived with a heavy stillness, as though the house itself had decided to listen rather than speak. The sky outside was pale and flat, holding no sign of sun. I moved into the kitchen quietly, each step deliberate on the cool floor. My husband was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the day's mail unopened in front of him. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were fixed on the window, watching nothing in particular. He greeted me evenly, and I returned the gesture, my voice calm despite the unease threading through me. A few minutes later, the guest room door opened. He entered with the same deliberate pace, offering a neutral morning to both of us. My husband's gaze shifted toward him briefly, and for a moment the room seemed smaller. The three of us sat together, the air carrying a quiet tension that neither words nor movement could fully erase. The conversation, when it came, was about the weather and the possibility of more rain by evening. Breakfast passed without incident, but my husband's silence felt different, less like distraction and more like patience. When the plates were cleared, he gathered his keys and jacket, saying he needed to run a quick errand in town. He didn't specify where, and I didn't ask. The sound of the front door closing left a space in the air that was both a relief and a warning. I moved to the sink to wash the dishes, the steady sound of water filling the silence. He stayed in the kitchen, leaning on the counter, his eyes following the movement of my hands. Neither of us spoke. Eventually, he stepped away, disappearing toward the garage. I heard the faint scrape of wood on concrete, then the rhythmic sound of a tool being used. The hours between morning and afternoon unfolded in a slow pattern. I completed small, necessary tasks, folding laundry, dusting the sideboard, sweeping the hallway. From time to time, I glanced through the back window at the garden, noting the damp soil and the faint sway of the taller plants in the breeze. The house was quiet, but the quiet had weight. When my husband returned in the early afternoon, he brought with him a bag of groceries and a small package from the post office. He set them on the counter and began unpacking without comment. I noticed his eyes scanning the kitchen briefly before settling on me. There was no accusation in his expression, only a calm that felt deliberate. He asked about the morning, and I gave a simple answer: chores, a little laundry, nothing unusual. He nodded, his hands moving methodically as he placed items in the pantry. The rest of the day moved with the same restrained rhythm. My husband worked at his desk for a few hours, while I prepared dinner. The scent of roasting vegetables filled the kitchen, and I kept my focus on the cutting board, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak from the hallway. He passed by once, heading toward the back door, and offered a small nod as he went outside. I watched him from the window as he crossed the yard, his steps unhurried, his posture straight. By evening, the three of us were gathered at the table again. The meal was quiet, each person speaking only when necessary. My husband asked a few questions about schedules for the coming week, his tone neutral, his gaze steady. When his eyes moved between us, they did so slowly, as though he were taking careful measure of something. He did not linger long on either of us, but the pauses in the conversation seemed to fill the room more than the words themselves. After dinner, we cleared the table together. My husband washed the dishes while I dried them, the two of us moving with the practiced efficiency of years. He spoke once, saying the garden would need more attention once the rain passed, and I agreed. His tone was as steady as ever, but there was a subtle edge in the way he watched my hands as I stacked the plates. Later, I stepped out onto the back porch, the air damp and cool. From here, the lights of the neighboring houses were faint glows against the darkening sky. Inside, the faint murmur of voices reached me, a low exchange between my husband and him, too quiet for the words to be distinct. I stayed where I was, leaning on the railing, listening to the steady sound of my own breathing until the voices stopped. When I came back in, my husband was alone in the living room, reading. He looked up briefly, his eyes meeting mine with an unreadable calm, then returned to his book. The guest room door was closed, light seeping faintly from underneath. I passed it without pausing, moving through the house to turn off the remaining lights. Upstairs, the familiar creak of the second step sounded under my weight. I reached the landing and paused, listening. The house had settled into its night quiet, but there was a sense that something unspoken now belonged to all of us, a silent agreement, or perhaps the acknowledgement of what had already been seen. It was not confrontation, not yet. But it was no longer ignorance either. And in that silence, it was clear that nothing in the house would be quite the same again.